My friends, today is a first. Unless our club historian John Koopman corrects me, I hope he won't, I think I can say with confidence that today is the first time we have ever had a speaker whose mother and father have each graced our podium in the past. With Valerie Pringle, Margaret Trudeau gave a powerful speech to us in May of 2009 on new approaches to mental health. And Pierre Trudeau spoke to us on September the 29th, 1972, precisely a month before Election Day that year. It was, according to one of our presidents, Hal Jackman, one of the finest speeches ever given to the club. It was a tour de force on foreign policy, covering more than a dozen different themes and issues, and my thanks to my friend Noble Chumar for finding it on our website and pointing it out to me. Please have a look yourselves. At its highlight, he hailed Canada's role in global leadership, cited our early recognition of Communist China as the decision that set in motion President Nixon's travel to Peking. To an audience skeptical about Red China, that is to say us back in those days, he pointed out that Canada won too, citing our billions of dollars in wheat sales that might have been in peril if we had just followed the initiatives of others. Today, it is our privilege to hear the vision of the man whose commitment to public service is the product of those impressive parents. Friends, please welcome Joe Mancinelli from Liuna to introduce our special guest, Justin Trudeau. Mr. Mancinelli.
Thank you, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to be here with you to thank and introduce our speakers this afternoon, and of course, to participate as this afternoon's sponsors here at the Empire Club. Give me a moment. I'm using my iPad because it's the only way I can enlarge the writing big enough. My vanity, of course, is showing because I don't want to put my glasses on. Our very first speaker that I would like to introduce, who will be interviewing our keynote speaker this afternoon, is a moderator and interviewer, John Cruikshank. John Cruikshank is the president and publisher of the Toronto Star Corporation of Torstar. He is a veteran media industry executive with a long list of achievements such as Chief Operating Officer, Vice President and Publisher, Sunday Times Media Group, Publisher CBC News, served as Vice President and Co-Editor, and Chief Operating Officer and Publisher of the Chicago Group, the Sun-Times Media Group, Editor-in-Chief, Vancouver Sun, and Managing Editor of the Globe and Mail. And I'm sure that all of you will agree that John is a very successful and accomplished media executive, all maybe with the exception of Mayor Ford. I couldn't resist, sorry, John. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming John Cruikshank. It is indeed a pleasure for me to introduce our keynote speaker and guest here this afternoon. Over the past several years, the political landscape in Canada has changed, and has changed dramatically. There is, unfortunately, a disconnect with mainstream Canada, especially young people. Young people feel hopeless and detached from politics and from our governments. I, in particular, have 5 children and expecting a grandchildren in July. My kids show a level of pessimism that I certainly don't like when it comes to politics and getting involved in the political arena, supporting candidates. As an MP from Papineau, Quebec, Justin Trudeau has become, in a very short period of time, the hope that young Canadians have in reestablishing their hope in politics and in government in this great country, Canada. He is a champion for progressive changes in order to increase the percentage of young people that graduate from post-secondary education. He wants to ensure that our youth are the best educated in the world. Justin has vowed to increase federal government's participation in education right across Canada. But he doesn't stop with only our youth. He is committed to improving the delivery and quality of education for Canada's First Nations. I represent approximately over 100,000 construction workers. And I have to tell you that we have a very high level of employment right now, and we are grateful for all the infrastructure projects here in Ontario, for all the very large hydro projects in Atlantic Canada. We're doing extremely well when it comes to putting our members to work. Unfortunately, the negative side to that, we have a lot of members who are retiring, and there are enormous skill shortages right across the country. From Newfoundland right through to British Columbia in the construction industry, we are experiencing very high levels of employment, and it is causing skill shortages. Justin has committed to increase the federal government contribution for skills development from 50% to 75%. Justin has a real and unwavering commitment to Canada's future, not only in rebuilding the confidence in the Liberal Party of Canada, but to create a meaningful dialogue with all Canadians of all political stripes. His leadership skills are obviously part of his DNA, but Justin is passionate and making a real and meaningful change to the Canadian political landscape. Canadians in particular, young people and young Canadians, have a strong desire to reinvest in leadership that reinvests in Canada's future and can deliver hope to future Canadian leaders. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to introduce Canada's future Liberal leader, and, excuse me for being presumptuous, Canada's future Prime Minister. Ladies and gentlemen, Justin Trudeau.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Justin, thank you so much for agreeing to talk with us rather than to talk at us. That's a wonderful innovation in thinking about communicating with Canadians. I wanted to start. I know that at a certain point, as this opportunity appeared, you felt kind of reluctant about jumping in. You weren't sure that it was the right thing to do. Perhaps you even feared replicating some of the front runners who didn't succeed when it came to game night. Can you talk a little bit about why you made the decision to get in?
Thank you. First of all, I mean, this format was one that was interesting to me because I've been across the country giving an awful lot of speeches, and one of the things that I find is all too often politics is not about the kinds of conversations that we need to have. And folded up in my decision to eventually actually seek the leadership of the Liberal Party was this idea that politics needs to be done differently. I mean, every politician says that, so actually trying to think about how it is actually done was key to my reflection. And for a long time, I, as you said, was hesitant. There was a sense that the Liberal Party was looking for quick fixes still, even after all the losses of the past years. People sort of turned to me and, you know, without knowing me, to the legacy and everything that goes with me, and said, okay, we'll pick Justin and then everything will fall into place. And it really worried me that so many people were thinking that way, and it made a very easy decision for me to say, no, you know what, I'm not giving that option to that easy way out. We have an awful lot of work together, and I'll do it as a simple MP. But then as time went on, and actually I'd found myself in a very serene position of saying no, I wasn't going to do it. And that actually allowed me to think about in very detached terms, detached from everyone who said you really should do this or you need to do this, to say, okay, should I? And most importantly, could I? And was the balance between family and the life something that I was willing to undertake, someone who had certainly known it better than most from my own experience growing up. And it sort of shifted from I can't run for leader because I love my kids too much to I need to run for leader because I love my kids so much. Because I realized that being a good father, being a good parent is not about just being there every night to tuck my kids to bed. It's about making sure I'm doing everything I can to provide for them. And my skill set, I think, lends itself to building a better country for my kids to grow up in. And that's ultimately what made me change my mind.
Well, your focus in the early going has been building a better party as much as looking at the bigger issues.
Yeah, very much. I think the challenge that we identified as a party was that the Liberal Party had no longer the capacity to connect with Canadians, no longer had earned Canadians' trust and confidence. And for me, it's not about demonstrating to the Liberal Party that we're smart and we have the solution and the answers to bring forward that'll fix this country's challenges. It was about instead drawing Canadians back in, not just to the Liberal Party, but to the idea of politics, to the sense that each and every one of us as citizens can and must contribute our voice, our concerns, our actions to shape the country that we're so proud of. And that, for me, was the big challenge. How do we draw Canadians who are increasingly cynical back towards politics? And that happens by reaching out, by building an organization that has 10,000 volunteers right across the country, a strong presence of riding captains and volunteers in every single riding across the country. And that organization is the base of it.
Sure. Now, since we're so close to Bay Street, sitting on its edge, I thought I'd better ask you some financial questions, some economic questions.
Sure.
But, I come from the Toronto Star, so we characterize those questions always in social justice terms. So one of the issues that has become, you know that.
Real popular on Bay Street. Actually, increasingly so, which is nice.
Which is nice. We have our friends here, too. The issue that has become a big one everywhere in the first world, but one that is felt acutely by many Canadians, is the growing division between especially the very richest and the very poorest in this country. The government in place has alternately said they don't have the tools to do anything, or they don't have the will to do anything. How can you achieve the kind of economic growth we need to employ young people and achieve a level of social justice as well?
Well, I mean, that's the central question that Canadian governments over successive iterations and ideologies have always struggled with, because we are a country that has figured out that they both go together, a strong economy and a strong sense of social justice and the kind of economic opportunities and upward mobility that really has defined this country, because every generation successively has been able, through their hard work, through being there for each other, been able to create opportunities for the next generation that are greater than we ourselves achieved. But before we get too far into the detailed economics of it, I think it's really important that we lay out sort of the base idea of what makes a strong economy. And how do you define a strong economy? Because for a long time, we've just anchored ourselves in, well, GDP and growth and trade balance, productivity measures, and those are all important indicators. But I think ultimately what we have to remind ourselves is a strong economy is one that provides the largest number of good jobs for the largest number of Canadians. We are too small a country in relative terms to the United States, to the entire world actually, to allow ourselves to not focus on drawing the very best out of every single individual. And for too long, the way we've defined our economy has allowed us to forget about the center and the strength of the economy, which has always been a prosperous, vibrant, and upwardly mobile middle class. We have lost that in this country. Over the past 30 years, even though the economy has grown over 100%, more than doubled in size, median family incomes have increased by only 13%. So we have, over the past 30 years, collectively, and with governments, made a deal with citizens, with voters, to pursue a growth agenda. And that means investments in education, it means openness towards trade, it means support for businesses, and an approach that has very much been pro-growth. But the deal underlining that approach has always been that the middle class, that the people who worked hardest day in and day out, people who make average family incomes of about $65,000 after taxes for two-parent families, get to participate in that growth and prosperity. And one of the things that I've seen right across the country is that people have the sense that Canada's doing well. Our country is doing well, if you ask them. I mean, they keep hearing, we're doing better than Spain and any other example. But when you press them a little harder, and you say, okay, Canada's doing well, how are you doing? And they admit that there are challenges. As incomes are sort of stagnating and people haven't really had a real raise in the past 30 years, we're facing the fact that costs are rising, as they do, and personal and household debts are exploding. And there's a very fundamental breakdown that has allowed for the politics of negativity and division and cynicism to hold sway, because Canadians are unsure that collectively we are prospering by this great Canadian project, that this country is doing well for everyone. And we see it in the fact that the middle class is struggling, and we can't seem to turn that around. And a strong middle class, I'm a big fan of the Atkinson principles, so I know where you're coming from. We have to make sure that we're giving opportunities and a capacity to succeed to the most vulnerable in Canada. But the way we do that is by providing them a ladder where they can hope to achieve strong middle-class jobs, where they can provide for themselves, and where we, as a society, have the economic success that allows us to create the services and the opportunities that our most vulnerable need. And that goes through a strong and prosperous middle class. And that, for me, is why that is what I have talked about since the beginning of this campaign, because it's not the lens through which we normally look at economics. And it's certainly not the lens that we're seeing from this current government in terms of the budget. I mean, they say they don't have the will, they don't say they don't have the ability. I'm sorry, I don't believe that. Because Canada has met and achieved extraordinary things in the past when we pulled together, when we worked together, when we had a vision for solving the challenges that come inherently in having a place that's too big, too empty, and too damn cold too many months of the year. And I will not allow us to simply coast and say, oh, this is a real problem, so we're not going to deal with it. We need to once again engage with these issues in a substantive, in a long-term, in a structural way, and not just tweak around the edges because of political targets that this current government has set itself.
Can you talk a little bit then about how concretely your agenda would differ from that of this government on these issues? Because we're always hearing about trade-offs. We can't do anything about the environment because there's a trade-off. We can't.
Well, I mean, that's a great example. Let's start with that. We have a government that has been single-mindedly focused on the economics side of the false question that shows, economy or environment. I mean, they're still thinking there's a choice to be made, one or the other. And their single-minded focus on economics and their putting aside of the environment has actually led us to the position we're in on Keystone Pipeline, for example, which is an extremely important initiative for this government in terms of getting our raw resources to market, where the Americans have turned to us and are saying, you know what, because you haven't done a good enough job worrying about the environmental impacts of your economic development, we're having a really hard time approving of the actual prosperity agenda that you're putting forward. And this is something that is entirely of the Conservatives' own making, because we have pushed at them in the House, all opposition parties, to do something about climate change, to take significant action. And every time they say, no, the economy is too important. But what we're discovering is the economy is too important to neglect the environment. And that's just one example of the false choices. The other one is and the one that's near and dear to my heart, and certainly Joseph and Leona sort of talked about this as well, is the fact that the challenges of our future will only be met by investing in our greatest resource. And we have a lot of advantages in this country and tremendous natural resources under our feet. But those aren't our greatest resources. And our geographical situation, perched on top of the US with easy ties back to Europe or forward to Asia, gives us tremendous advantages. But that's not our greatest advantage. Our greatest advantage remains Canadians ourselves. Open-minded, value-based, ambitious, confident, willing to challenge ourselves in our world and become better. And that's why I've set forward a target of 70% participation in post-secondary education, up from 50%. And that just doesn't mean more university degrees. It means a better emphasis on skills training, on diplomas, on trades, on apprenticeships, on the kinds of things that are going to drive this country forward. Now, the government put forward an agenda around the budget that says it's willing to invest in training, but the provinces have to come up with $5,000 in matching funds, new money from what the government's going to put forward, and we have to find private sector partners. But there's a really interesting dynamic around around training that I don't think this government fully appreciates, is that training has to be federally funded to almost its entirety. Yes, we need to make sure that the provinces and the regions on the ground who have access to what actually skill shortages and what they need deliver and direct it. But because of interprovincial mobility that we want to encourage, we can't expect provinces to invest huge amounts of money in it, more than they already are, without having the federal government say, well, we understand Canadians crisscross the country, and therefore we have a responsibility as a whole. And the private sector is always worried about overtraining its people so that they can go off and find a better job to people who can pay them more because they haven't had to pony up for training programs. So there's real inherent contradictions in that. And for me, yes, we need private sector participation. Yes, we need to make sure that we're working with the provinces and the regions who know what the needs are. But ultimately, it is the federal government that needs to make sure that we are investing directly in Canadians' capacity to learn and to retrain. And not just young people, but the fact that we're going to go through 5 or 6 different careers through the course of our life means that it is the workers who need to have the ability and the capacity to reach out, to relearn, to develop, and to grow. And these are things that this government simply doesn't get in terms of investing in people.
I think everybody here agrees with the notion that it is the people of Canada who are its great wealth and its great strength. But we have at various times in our history hobbled ourselves by our divisiveness. And I wanted to bring you to that. You reached out to the West in a fascinating way, symbolically and historically. You also took a very firm stand on issues within Quebec and distinguished yourself very much from Tom Mulcair. But talk a little bit about that and about your view of the country as a whole.
Well, I think everybody knows, as I'm constantly reminded from liberals who are terrifically worried about what might happen after this leadership race is over, because it's happened in the past, the Conservatives are going to go extremely negative because that's just what they do. And we know that it works. Well, they do it because it works. Negative ads work. But they don't work in terms of convincing people to vote for Mr. Harper instead of that nice Mr. Ignatieff or Mr. Dion or perhaps Ms. Marie or Mr. Trudeau. What they work to do is convince people not to vote for the person who's the target of the ad. So it's fundamentally about suppressing the vote, about convincing people to stay home and to disengage. And that's part of why there has been such an increase in cynicism while there has been a decrease in voter turnout. And I look at what Mr. Harper has done, and sort of the political scientist in me is sort of impressed by the level of control and dominance and aggressivity and strategic divisions that he's been able to achieve a majority government with. But I know that it doesn't represent what Canada is. We are a country of extraordinary diversity that was founded by the founding peoples of English and French, drawing on the wisdom and the experience of living on this land for tens of thousands of years by our First Nations people. But from the very beginning, we had to understand that someone completely different from us was just as much Canadian as we were. And that has evolved into a country that defines itself not as strong in spite of its differences, but strong because of those differences. And yes, there's a lot of fault lines we can play up to divide this country. But for me, it's much more interesting to look for those common values that actually define the Canadian identity, because we're not defined by religion or language or culture or ethnicity or other backgrounds. We're defined by shared values of openness, respect, compassion, justice, a willingness to work hard, a desire to be there for each other, equality, these kinds of things that come together to articulate the particular shared identity that we have as Canadians that resonates from coast to coast to coast. So when Mr. Mulcair decided that the best tactic to take to defeat Mr. Harper was to follow his lead and to choose to divide by attacking the resource economy of the West as a way of leveraging votes from the progressives in the East, by playing extremely dangerous games with soft nationalists and sovereigntists in Quebec as a way of reinforcing his own base, I am reminded of why it is so important that the Liberal Party exists, that we remain a pragmatic, values-based alternative. A government or a party that is not going to be wrapped up in a particular ideology of the left or of the right, but very much look at, well, what works? What does evidence tell us? Base our policies around best practices and reach out to try and build, not for one region of the country we think we can win over, but all regions of the country where we need to resonate around the same values and the same goals, because that's what we have. And I'll admit it, it's a bit of a gamble. Because right now I'm hinging an awful lot on the fact that Canadians are tired of being cynical. That if given a choice, we won't simply be satisfied with voting against the left from the right or against the right from the left, but instead actually vote for a vision, a comprehensive view of this country that includes everyone in every region. But of course, before we can present the actual platform that will have a vision and a long-term view of the strength of this country, We have to do a good job of reminding Canadians that politics is supposed to be about a comprehensive platform, a long-term vision for this country, a sense of how we're going to build together. That's the gamble I'm taking, but if there is one thing that I learned from my parents, it's that it's not much of a gamble when the gamble is trusting Canadians to be better, to be more, and to step up, because that's what we've always done.
The issue of disengagement is particularly acute amongst youngest Canadians. When you look at voting participation in federal elections, the lowest participation rates are actually the last 4 federal elections in the history since Confederation. And it's all driven by the fact that younger Canadians are not entering into the political mainstream. That's also not a bad way of looking at the broader democracy gap that young people feel. They don't feel that level of engagement. How do you speak particularly to them?
I think one of the things that we have to remember is that young people get a bad rap sometimes for being overly cynical and apathetic. But the reality is, for those of you with teenagers who are studying or who know what young people are going through, there is a generation of young people who are more informed, more aware, more conscious of what's going on around big issues in the world around them than any previous generation. The apathy, which does exist, comes not from not caring about the world, but from caring so much there's a level of frustration that they don't get to weigh in, that they don't get to be given the tools that actually allow them to contribute, to shape the world that they're supposedly going to be inheriting. So one of the things I find is that it's not that young Canadians are disengaged or disinvolved. And yes, young Canadians are a higher level of disengagement than other, but every age range is disengaging from politics as well. It's not a reflection of citizens not understanding how to shape the world around them or the importance of it. It's a reflection of the fact that people increasingly don't see politics as a meaningful way of shaping the world around them for the better. They're happier to get involved in local community shelters or organizations, help out with a meaningful foundation in their city or their province, take on a big single issue cause, whether it's the environment or social justice or human rights around the world. We've just thrown up our hands and say politics is just about attack and negativity and winning and gaining and holding on to power and not about serving. And for me, that's exactly what we have to draw back to. I'm incredibly lucky that both my father was a strong example of how politics can shape the world for the better, but also my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, James Sinclair, who served as an RCAF officer in the Western Sahara during World War II at the same time as he was Member of Parliament for Vancouver North, elected in 1940. He served until 1958, and I understood that even though most of my friends grew up with parents' introduction to politics of parents, throwing shoes at the TV and yelling about broken campaign promises or higher taxes, I got to see that politics can be a very powerful way of shaping the world around us, and that's what I'm very much excited about what this campaign has done, as tens of thousands of young people have taken an interest in this campaign. Over 10,000 have actually actively volunteered and are making phone calls or going door to door or organizing, and really believing that politics can and must be a meaningful vector for change in this world. And by dint of their belief that it can be, it becomes so.
Premier Wynne made a very powerful statement at a speech she gave a little more than a week ago, and I believe you attended.
Yes.
And her focus was precisely on that, on the poison in politics today, the poison that comes from a level of partisanship that trumps the interests of citizens. How can you avoid it? How can you go into a leadership position? How can you rebuild your partisan base and avoid that kind of poisonous partisanship?
Well, I think there's two ways of looking at it. The first one is almost philosophical, where I realize that I'm doing this not because of the great salary and the glory. I'm doing this because trust me, I'm doing this because I deeply believe that I have something to offer that this country could use. And the focus that I have is on actually addressing some of the big structural challenges that have crept up on us while we were coasting. And for me, you can't do that if you've got people to think of voting against. If people are just willing to pick the least worst or the one that'll most stay out of their way to let them try and thrive and survive on their own. I mean, Canada is a country that builds together, that works together, that has a government that understands, in the ideal, that there is a role to play for government in offering stability and opportunity for everyone. It's not the heavy-handedness we've seen in the past, but there is a role there. So I don't think we can actually achieve the goals that I've set out in politics to achieve if we start to go negative. That's the theoretical base. But the practical base is that we have two parties that are ideologically based around the fringes. And if you think of the Canadian electorate and its interest in politics as a bell curve, the NDP and the Conservatives have managed to wrap up the political fringes and have drawn them in. And the political fringes, or the extremes, is where you can mobilize the most enthusiastic, passionate advocates of particular polarized positions. And they're great for fundraising, and they're great for volunteerism and organization. But they're all wrapped up on the hard left and the hard right. Where we, as a Liberal Party, need to be focused on is the actual large mass of Canadians who pay attention to politics, during election times, or monitor it out of the corner of their eye as they leaf through the newspapers or watch the morning news, but who are not driven by a specific polarizing issue. And our challenge as a party is how to get those people to re-engage fully with politics. And that's where we see the decline in voter turnout. And I believe that the decline in voter turnout that we've seen over the past decade or so is directly contributing to the decline of the Liberal Party. As people who go about their daily lives with all their concerns and responsibilities and priorities begin to believe that politics is less useful or meaningful than before, well, then we get a dominance of the smaller numbers of people who are more and more polarized. And for me, going positive, as Premier Wynne has talked about, is really the only way to fold people back into the kind of conversation, the kinds of project that this magnificent country actually represents. It is for us, once again, to be involved in rebuilding this country as citizens, as members of families, as workers, as employers, as employees. We as Canadians get to decide how we are governed and how the world around us unfolds. We've absolved ourselves, or we've distanced ourselves from that responsibility too much over past years, which has allowed the politics of negativity to hold sway. And again, I'm taking a bit of a gamble, declaring that I will not go negative, declaring that I'm willing and open to fold in people from everywhere, that I'm willing and have decided that local riding associations are going to pick their next candidates for the Liberal Party, not the leader. These are the things that matter most to people because what we've seen, particularly out west, in the reform base of Alberta, where I was stunned to see 250 people come out to see me in Ponoka, which is north of Red Deer. If 250 people are coming out to see me in rural Alberta, it's not because they think the name is glamorous, okay? There are other challenges going. It's because people are tired of electing good people to be their voices in Ottawa and instead getting representatives for Mr. Harper back in their communities. That's got to stop, and that's the kind of openness and positive engagement that I truly believe Canada not just deserves, but Canada desperately wants. And that's what I'm hoping the Liberal Party will rebuild.
John? I'm afraid I'm going to have to bring this fascinating conversation to an end.
Thank him on behalf of everybody. Thank you, Justin.
Thank you, John.
Cam de Prada will do the appreciation for our speakers. Cam?
So Justin, on behalf of the Empire Club of Canada, please accept our sincere thanks for sharing your thoughts on some of the more pressing issues of the day. A warm thank you as well goes out to John Cruikshank for moderating a lively and engaging discussion with one of the dynamic voices in the Canadian political scene. So thank you, John. This is what I believe we heard today, and I'm very hopeful that you will share these thoughts. We heard the voice of a new generation, a voice of positive, constructive ideas, a voice of optimism, a voice with priorities focused on improving and re-energizing the well-being of the middle class, and importantly, a voice of a leader that recognizes that our collective well-being as Canadians depends on our providing upward mobility for all Canadians, not just a few. So Justin, for this and more, we thank you for joining us today. We wish you good luck with the rest of the campaign and much continued success. Bon appétit, everyone.